At 7:42 on a Wednesday night in February, a CAD file wasn't where it should have been, and 9 years of my life came apart. I didn't yell, I didn't call him, I didn't even stand up. I just sat in my office chair in the corner of a small materials lab in an industrial park outside of Mesa, Arizona, with the fluorescents humming overhead and a half-eaten container of leftover Thai food cooling on my desk, and I watched a single line of file metadata for about 90 seconds. And then I closed the file, and I closed my laptop. And I drove home in absolute silence, with the radio off and both windows cracked. And what I did over the next 8 months I want to walk you through, step by step. Welcome to Ruthless Retribution. If you're already in this with me, a quick like genuinely helps this story travel to the next person who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done at 7:42 that night, even one word. And don't be shy, the comment section on these is half the reason I keep telling them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Here's what I need you to understand before I tell you any of the rest of it. The man I'm going to tell you about was my best friend for 9 years. He was the best man at my wedding. He stood next to me in a slate gray suit he kept tugging at the lapel of, and he made a toast about a graduate school whiteboard that made my mother laugh until she cried. He was the godfather of my daughter. He drove 3.5 hours from Palo Alto to a hospital in San Diego the night she was born, and he sat in the waiting room with my father until the sun came up. He held my hand at my father's funeral in 2019, and he didn't say a single word for the entire 40-minute service, and that was exactly the right thing. He built half of everything I own with me. Our names were on the same building lease. Our names were on the same Series B term sheet. Our names were, until that Wednesday night in February, on the same United States patent, number 11,624,083, for a semiconductor packaging process we'd sketched on a paper napkin in a cafe in Palo Alto in the spring of 2017. And on that Wednesday night in February at 7:42 p.m. I found out he had been licensing that patent, our patent, to a competitor in Singapore for 22 months through a shell company in Wyoming that he owned and I'd never heard of, for $1.4 million. And the wild part isn't the money. The wild part is what I decided to do about it. Because what I'm about to tell you only makes sense if you understand how much of my life he was already inside. So let me back up. Let me back up a long way, because the only way any of this makes sense is from the beginning. His name was Thomas Reinhardt. And the first time I met him I was 35 years old, in the second week of a materials science seminar at Stanford, and he was the loudest student in the room. He had a laugh you could hear in the hallway. He had a kind of charisma I didn't have at 35 and didn't have at 44 either. He was the kind of student the professors half disliked because he interrupted them in lecture, and the kind of student they couldn't fail because his interruptions were always, and I want to be fair about this, they were always correct. And I was the older student in the back row who had already done 7 years of process engineering in San Jose, and who actually liked the smell of a clean room, and who actually wanted to learn about thin film deposition the slow way. We got paired up on a final project, a small thing, a modeling exercise on grain boundaries in copper interconnects. 2 weeks of work. Thomas did about 1/3 of it. I did about 2/3. He gave the presentation. The professor, a small Belgian man named Dr. Mays, who had been teaching at Stanford for 31 years, called it the best project he'd seen that semester. And on the way out of the lecture hall that afternoon, Thomas turned to me and he said something I never forgot. He said, "Aaron, you and me, we should start a company someday. You're the quiet brain, I'm the loud mouth. We'd make a small fortune and we wouldn't even hate each other." I was 35 years old and I was flattered, and I laughed and I said, "Yeah, sure we would." And then we did. We actually did. The company was called Solin Microsystems. We started it in a 600 square foot warehouse bay in a Mesa industrial park in the fall of 2017. Thomas was 36. I had just turned 37. We had $84,000 between us, most of it mine, from a deferred comp payout at the company I'd left in San Jose, and a slide deck I'd built on his kitchen table in Palo Alto over a long weekend the previous May. We had one used wire bonder a Taiwanese fab had shipped us out of pity. We had a beat-up Honda Civic that ran most days. And we had this idea, sketched on a napkin at a cafe off University Avenue called Koopa 3 weeks before we filed our first provisional, that if we could build a semiconductor packaging process that didn't require a single rare earth element to seal the substrate, we'd find a way to feed ourselves. And it worked. It actually worked. The first year we burned through about $60,000 and earned about $4,000. The second year, a small Fabulous design house in Austin gave us a $40,000 pilot. The third year we filed the patent, the napkin one, US 11,624,083, with both our names on it as inventors, and we closed a Series A from a corner of a Sand Hill firm I had never expected would take our call. By the seventh year we had 12 employees. We had a real clean room in a real industrial park with a real visitor sign-in book. We had 2 issued patents and 3 pending. We had a Series B at a $40 million post-money valuation, led by a man named Brian Chen who had quietly become, I will tell you more about him later, the only board member who would matter in any of this. I want to be honest with you about how the work split out, because it matters later. I designed, I modeled, I worked the bench, I wrote the process specs. I sat at a CAD station and I drew the deposition flows for 90 hours a week in 2018 and 2019. Thomas sold, Thomas charmed. Thomas closed the Series A in a conference room on Sand Hill Road, and he closed the Series B in a different conference room on Sand Hill Road, and he took the design house engineers out to dinner at the steakhouse in Tempe whenever they flew in to visit. And that was a real skill. I want to say that clearly. He was good at it. He earned what he earned. For the first 7 years, he earned every dollar that came through the door of Solene Microsystems. Now I have to tell you about my wife. Because my wife came into my life through Thomas too, and that's a sentence I never thought I'd be saying out loud. It was the spring of 2018. We had been in the Mesa warehouse for about 6 months. Thomas had a sister who lived in Tucson. The sister had a friend. Her name was Saba. She was 33. She was a hospital pharmacist at the Children's Hospital downtown. She had a very quiet way of asking questions, almost an apology built into her voice, like she had been raised to never take up more room than she had to. We met at a backyard barbecue at Thomas's apartment in Mesa in March of that year. Thomas had a brand new gas grill he kept showing off. Saba and I sat on a low concrete planter while Thomas was inside getting more drinks, and we talked for about an hour and a half about absolutely nothing. About the smell of the desert after rain, about a small Ethiopian restaurant on Apache Boulevard she'd been to once and remembered the bread from. About the way the clean room I worked in sounded, the white noise of it, and whether or not that was something a person could miss when they weren't in it. I drove home that night, 38 years old, and I told myself out loud in the car, and I remember this. I said, Aaron, you are going to marry that woman. 2 years later I did. Tomas was my best man. His wife Greta, a pediatric oncologist he had married 7 months before Saba and I met, was a groomsperson. Greta was the kind of woman who showed up to things with a Tupperware container of food nobody had asked her to bring. She had been raised in a Swiss-German household in St. Louis, and she made my mother feel comfortable at our rehearsal dinner in a way I will never quite know how to thank her for. The 4 of us became, the way these things go, a foursome. Sunday dinners at our house, Sunday dinners at theirs, a long weekend in Sedona every Veterans Day, a camping trip to the South Rim every April. My daughter was born in 2021. Thomas drove 3.5 hours from Mesa to a hospital in San Diego the night she was born. He stayed until the next morning. Greta brought a casserole the next week. Their daughter Marina, 3 years older than mine, held my daughter for her first 2-month photograph, and we framed that photograph, and it hangs in my living room. It still hangs there. I haven't taken it down. I am not sure I ever will. That's the picture I want you to have in your head. That's the wallpaper of my life for almost a decade. The lab, the clean room, the 4 of us. My daughter learning to walk in their living room the spring she turned 1, with Marina holding her by the back of her shirt, calling her Pepper, which was the family nickname for a reason I will never quite be able to explain. The Thanksgivings at our house, the Easters at theirs, the pictures on the refrigerator, the small folded paper napkin from Coupa Cafe in 2017, the one with the original IP sketch on it that Thomas had laminated and hung in a frame on the wall of his office at Solin with the date written in the corner in my handwriting, March 14, 2017. That's the wallpaper. That's what I was looking at every single day of my life and not really seeing. And then on a Wednesday evening in February at 7:42 p.m., I tried to open a CAD file that wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was a process file for our next generation wafer, the one we'd been calling internally Selene 3, the one that was going to ship in December. I had spent the day on the bench and I was sitting in my office trying to log a small change to the deposition recipe, and the file I was looking for, the one named SOL3DEP-REV117, CAD, was not in the shared engineering folder. There was a file named SOL3DEP-REV117, CAD, BAK. And there was a file named SOL3DEP-REV117, CAD. Last modified 4 hours earlier. And there was a third file in the folder. And I read the name 3 times before I understood what I was reading. Named RHMDPay-REV04, CAD. Last modified the previous afternoon by an account that didn't exist on our internal directory. The prefix RHM. I did not know what RHM stood for. I had spent every working day of the previous 9 years inside the file structure of that company, and I had never seen those 3 letters together. And right there, sitting at my desk in the dark of an empty office, with the clean room HVAC humming through the wall behind me, my whole life got very, very quiet. So I sat at my desk in that dark office and I looked at those 3 felines for a long time. SOL3DAPA-REV17, CAD, BAK, SOL3DAPA-REV18, CAD, RHMDAPA-REV04, CAD. And after about 10 minutes I opened the third one. I opened it in read-only mode. I want you to know that. I did not want to leave a fingerprint anywhere. The file was a deposition recipe, our deposition recipe, the one we used to seal the substrate without a single rare earth element, the one in the napkin, the one in the patent, the one we had spent 3 years inside a clean room learning to dial in 0.2 of a degree at a time. The header of the file said, in a generic title block I had never seen before, a title block in a Helvetica font Thomas always preferred and I always quietly disliked. Riverhead Microsystems, Ptt. Liftdeed, Confidential, Process Tech Transfer, Rev 04. Riverhead Microsystems. I did not know that name. I have a memory for names. I have spent 20 years in a field with about 400 people in it, and I had never once in my life heard those 2 words next to each other. I sat with that file open for about 3 minutes. I did not save anything. I did not print anything. I did not copy anything. I closed it. I shut down my workstation the way I always shut down my workstation, and I drove home in the dark. I want to tell you about the drive home, because it's the moment I think about more than any other moment in this whole story. Mesa to my house is about a 22-minute drive at that hour, mostly empty desert highway with the Superstition Mountains a black shape to the east. I drove the whole way at 4 miles an hour under the limit, with both hands on the wheel, and I did not turn on the radio, and I will tell you what I was thinking. I was thinking about my father. My father was a process engineer. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2019, 6 months after we filed the second of our patents at Solene. The last thing he said to me, in a hospice room in San Diego with the late afternoon sun coming through the blinds in long bars across the bedsheet, was, and I want you to sit with the exact phrasing, he said, "Aaron, the grain knows. Trust the grain, brother. Don't force it." He had called me brother my whole life. I am his only son. The reason I am telling you this is because Tomas, for some reason I never quite understood, maybe because he heard me say it at my father's funeral, had started using the same phrase about a year after my father died. Trust the grain, brother. He said it in board meetings. He said it to me exactly once in the parking lot of our building, the morning we closed the Series B, with both hands on my shoulders, and I had loved him for it. I really had, because I thought he was carrying my father with me. I pulled into my own garage at 8:34 p.m. I sat in the truck for about 6 minutes with the engine off. Saba had texted me from inside the house, "You're home? Everything okay?" And I texted back, "Yay, long day, eating in the office, be in a minute." And I sat in the truck and I thought about what I was about to walk into. My wife was in the kitchen. My daughter was in her room doing 3rd grade math homework. The framed photograph of Marina holding her at 2 months old was on the wall of the living room I was about to walk through. And the man whose face was probably in 3 other photographs in that same house had been using my father's last words to sell a board on a story that he had been quietly unselling for almost 2 years. I walked in. I kissed my wife on the side of the head. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of my daughter's bed and I told her she was getting good at long division. I came back down. I ate the leftover Thai food standing up at the counter in about 4 minutes. I told Saba I had a deposition recipe review to finish. I went into the small office off our kitchen, the one with the door that closes, and I closed it, and I started gathering. Quietly. Carefully. The way my father used to handle a piece of stock he was trying to read the grain of before he set the blade. The first thing I did was nothing for about 40 minutes. I just looked at our shared engineering drive, the one Solene's whole team used. I looked at the directory structure. I looked at access logs. I am one of 2 people with audit privileges, the other is Tomas, and I went back 2 years. The RHM folder had been created 22 months earlier, on a Tuesday in April. Inside it were 41 files, process recipes, wafer geometry specs, yield curve data from our last 6 pilot runs. The whole technical core of Solene Microsystems, reformatted into Riverhead Microsystems title blocks, sitting in a folder that I, as a co-founder, as a co-inventor, as the technical lead, had never been told existed. And the access log told me exactly 2 accounts had ever opened any of those files, Tomas's account, and 1 external collaborator account, last name Lim, with an email domain at riverhead-micro.com seg. I sat in that small office at 9:47 p.m. and I wrote down on a yellow legal pad, a brand new one I had pulled out of the bottom drawer that night, and decided right then that it was my pad now, no one else was going to write on it. I wrote down, RHM Pequer Riverhead Microsystems PEE Singapore. External collaborator, Lim, riverheadmicro.com.seg. Folder created April 2 years ago, 41 files, and then I underlined the date and I wrote next to it, "This is the moment." The second thing I did was the inventorship paragraph, because something in my head was already telling me, and I want to be careful here, because hindsight does this thing where it makes you sound smarter than you were in real time. Something in my head, at about 10 p.m. that Wednesday night, was already telling me that if Tomas had been doing this for 22 months and was sloppy enough to leave a Helvetica title block in a shared engineering folder, he had probably been sloppy somewhere else too. So I went back to our patent, United States Patent 11,624,083, filed in 2018, issued in 2020. I opened the issued copy from the USPTO public database. And I opened my own personal copy, the one I had filed away on my home laptop the day it was issued, and the two were not the same. In the issued copy, the inventorship paragraph had been amended, quietly, in the prosecution history, in a continuation filing dated November of 2019, and one sentence had been changed. One sentence. In the original, the sentence said that the deposition temperature methodology was originally conceived by both inventors during a joint session in March of 2017. In the amended version, that sentence said it had been originally conceived solely by inventor Reinhardt, with subsequent contribution by inventor Bike. One word changed the inventorship of the most valuable claim in our entire patent. I sat in that small office at 10:42 p.m., and I want to tell you what that meant in practical terms. If the deposition temperature methodology had been originally conceived solely by Thomas, then Thomas, under the licensing rights paragraph of our founders' agreement, which I was finally rereading line by line for the first time in 7 years, had a unilateral right to license that claim to a third party without my signature. If it had been jointly conceived, he did not. That single November 2019 paragraph rewrite, filed in a continuation I had never been told about, paid for out of a legal services line item I had approved without thinking, was the legal hatch he had quietly cut for himself in the floor of our patent. 22 months before he ever wired the first dollar to Wyoming, I wrote that down on the legal pad, 2 underlines, and then I went looking for Wyoming. I want to tell you what I found, briefly, because the speed of finding it told me almost as much as the thing itself. Saba had gone to bed at 10:30. I logged into our old Google Workspace, the one we'd stopped using as a primary in 2021 but which still had 3 years of shared drive metadata on it. And I went into a folder Thomas had created in 2020 called Operations, Admin, Please Do Not Touch. Which is, in retrospect, the kind of folder name a man writes when he has not been paying attention to who he is writing to. I opened a metadata sidecar on a scanned document. The upload side metadata still showed the source path it had come from, a folder on Thomas's laptop named BMRH Formation Docs. And in that folder, in metadata he had never bothered to scrub, was a corporate services receipt from a registered agent in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The LLC name on the receipt was Black Mesa Resin Holdings, LLC, sole member, Thomas G. Reinhardt. I wrote that down on the legal pad, 3 underlines, and then I closed the laptop. And I sat in that small office in the dark at 11:14 p.m. with my hands flat on the desk, and I did not move for about 6 minutes. And then I made the second decision that whole night. The decision was to smile. That was the decision. The decision was that I was going to walk upstairs in about 45 minutes. I was going to brush my teeth. I was going to slide into bed next to Saba, and I was going to set the alarm for 6:15 a.m. the way I always did. I was going to drive to Solene in the morning, and I was going to walk into Thomas's office, and I was going to ask him about the deposition recipe revision we had been arguing about all week, the way I would have asked him about it any other Thursday morning of any other normal week of any other year of my life. And I was not going to say a single word about Riverhead or RHM or Black Mesa Resin Holdings or November 2019 or my father's last sentence to a single human being on this earth, until I had every piece of paper I needed to bring it all down on him in a single week. Because here's the thing that came to me at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and I want to be honest about it, because I think it's the most honest thing I will tell you in this whole story. My first impulse sitting in that small office at 11:14 p.m. was to walk down the hall and wake Saba up and tell her everything. My second impulse, about 3 minutes later, was to get back in the truck, drive 22 minutes back to Mesa, ring Tomas's doorbell at midnight, and ask him to his face whether he had stolen our patent and lied about my father's words while he did it. And I sat with both of those impulses on the floor of the small office for about 40 minutes, and I let them pass. And what was left when those two went away was a third thing. A quieter thing. A thing I had not known I had in me until that night. The third thing said, he is going to lose all of it, and he is never going to know it's coming from me. Thursday morning, 7:52 a.m. I walked into the office. I poured a cup of coffee. I knocked on Tomas's door the way I always did. He waved me in. He was on a phone call with Brian Chen. I could tell from the way he was sitting, slightly forward, both elbows on the desk, and he held up a finger and mouthed 2 minutes and grinned at me. And I smiled back. I smiled at him. And I went and I sat on the small couch against the far wall of his office, under the framed Coupa Café napkin, the one with my own handwriting in the corner, March 14, 2017, and I waited for him to finish his call. He hung up. He turned to me. He said, "Aaron, brother, you look like you didn't sleep." And I smiled and I said, "Yeah, kid had a stomach thing last night, was up at 2. And he laughed and he said, "Get the kid some Pedialyte, man." And I said, "Yeah, I will." And he said, "Listen, trust the grain, brother. We're gonna have a really good quarter." And I sat under that napkin and I smiled at him and I said, "I think we are." Thursday night was my daughter's 3rd grade school play. She was a tree. She had one line. I sat in the 3rd row of a small auditorium with Saba on my left and Greta Reinhardt on my right. Tomas was at a dinner in Phoenix that night with the design house, and Greta leaned over to me during intermission and she said, "You look tired, Aaron." And I smiled at her. And I said, "I am. A little." And she patted my hand. And on the drive home, with my daughter asleep in the back seat, I drove past the exit for our office, and I thought to myself, very quietly, this is going to take 8 months, and that is okay. The grain will tell me which way it wants to go. And on Saturday morning, at 4 in the morning, with Saba asleep upstairs and my daughter asleep in the next room, I sat at my own kitchen table with the legal pad in front of me and a single mug of black coffee at my elbow, and I made the decision that everything else would come from. The decision was that I needed a lawyer, not our company lawyer, not the small commercial firm in Mesa whose name was on 3 of our cap table documents. Not anybody whose name had ever crossed a Solene email account, or whose firm had ever billed a Solene invoice, or who would, at any point in the next 6 months, have a reason to mention my name to Tomas Reinhardt at a bar association mixer. I needed somebody Tomas had never heard of, and I needed to find that person without a single Google search from any device on any network I had ever touched. So at 5 in the morning on that Saturday, I made a list on the legal pad of every person I had been to graduate school with at Stanford who I would still, 9 years later, actually trust with this. The list was 3 names long. I crossed 2 of them off because I knew their wives knew Tomas socially. The third name was a man named Daniel Park, who had been in my materials science cohort and was now a partner at an aerospace coatings firm in Albuquerque. I had not spoken to Daniel in about 4 years. I drove to a Circle K 6 miles from my house at 7 a.m. that Saturday. I bought a prepaid SIM with cash, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot and I called him from the new number. I said, "Daniel, it's Aaron Beekle. I am going to ask you for a thing and I am going to ask you not to tell anybody I asked. Can you do that for me?" And there was a small silence on the other end. And he said, "Aaron, whatever it is, yes." And I said, "I need an IP lawyer who will not be in any network I am already in. Phoenix area if possible. Inequitable conduct work. Quiet." Daniel didn't ask me a single question. He said he'd call me back in an hour. He called me back in 43 minutes. He said, "Aaron, there's a woman at a small firm in Phoenix named Nadia Okafor. She used to be a USPTO examiner. She left and went to law school in her 30s. She does small shop work because she doesn't like the big firms. I've watched her present at 2 CLEs. She is the most careful lawyer I have ever heard speak in public. Do not tell her where you got her name. I sat in the truck in the Circle K parking lot for about 10 minutes after that call ended, and I called Nadia Okafor's office answering service. I left a message. I said only that I was a co-founder at a small Arizona company, that I had a confidential matter that involved a possible inventorship issue, and that I would prefer to meet somewhere not her office. I left the prepaid number. I drove home. I made breakfast for my daughter. She wanted pancakes. I made pancakes. Nadia called me back on Monday afternoon from her cell, not her office. She did not introduce herself by her full name. She said, "The matter you mentioned in your message, I would like to hear about it. Cartel Coffee in Tempe, Wednesday morning, 7:14 a.m., the second floor back table. Bring nothing on a company device." I said okay. She said, "And one more thing. I do not ask questions I do not want answered. Be very careful what you tell me. I want to walk you through that first meeting because everything that followed came out of it." She was about my age, maybe 45. She wore a black blazer over a gray t-shirt. She had a small steel mug she had brought from home. She did not have a laptop. She had a single legal pad. She looked exactly like a person who had once been a USPTO examiner and had not let go of the habit. I told her what I had found. I told her about the Riverhead title block in the CAD file. I told her about the RHM folder. I told her about the November 2019 inventorship paragraph rewrite. I told her about Black Mesa Resin Holdings, LLC in Cheyenne. I did not tell her about my father. I did not tell her about my wife. I told her only the facts. She wrote on her legal pad for about 20 minutes without saying anything. Then she set down her pen and she looked at me over the rim of her steel mug and she said the words I had been waiting to hear without knowing I was waiting. She said, "Dr. Betrayal, what you are describing is called fraud on the patent office. The legal term of art is inequitable conduct. If we can establish that your co-founder knowingly made a material misrepresentation to the USPTO during the prosecution of the issued patent, with the intent to deceive, the patent, or at minimum the affected claim becomes unenforceable against everyone, including any licensee he has authorized, including any structure he has built downstream on top of those licenses." I sat with that for about a minute, and I said, "How long does it take?" And she said, "If you bring me a clean, complete file, 6 to 8 months, and it will take that long for a reason. The reason is that we will only ever do this once, Dr. BK. You don't get to refile inequitable conduct. So we are going to build the file the way a careful person builds a file, slowly, once, correctly." And I said, "Okay, how do we start?" And she said, "You bring me the file. I do not ever go onto any system you currently use. You bring printouts to a small office I keep in Tempe that has no sign on the door. You come on Saturdays. You park 3 blocks away. We label this engagement, on paper, as a routine patent maintenance review. If anybody asks you what you are doing on Saturdays, you tell them you are walking through your portfolio with outside counsel before a board meeting. No one questions a co-founder doing portfolio diligence in the run-up to a board meeting. It is the most invisible thing you can be doing. I started going to Tempe on Saturdays. I told Saba I had a quarterly portfolio review with a new outside counsel. She didn't ask twice. I would leave the house at 6:45 a.m. I would park 3 blocks from a small office in a converted bungalow on a side street near Mill Avenue. I would walk to the side door. I would let myself in with a key Nadia had given me at the end of the second meeting, and we would work for 4 hours. We built the file. We built it across April, May, June, July. We started with the inventorship paragraph rewrite, the November 2019 amendment, and Nadia walked me through, line by line, the prosecution history of US 11,624,083. She showed me 3 other small changes Tomas had made in continuations over the years. She showed me a declaration filed under penalty of perjury in 2020 in which Tomas had certified the inventorship facts in their then current form. That declaration, Nadia said it quietly, the way she said everything, that declaration is what makes this inequitable conduct rather than a clerical mistake. He swore to it. She brought in a forensic accountant named Sarah Boudreau in early May. Sarah was about 38, ex-FBI white-collar division. She walked into the bungalow office one Saturday morning with 2 cardboard boxes, sat down at the small table, and did not say a word for 90 minutes while Nadia briefed her. Then Sarah said, "I will need 3 things: the Wyoming registered agent docket, the Singapore corporate registry filings on Riverhead Microsystems PAT, and a quiet way to look at the operating account wire records of Selene Microsystems without anybody noticing I have been there." I told her I could get the 3rd one. We were halfway through. And here's the thing about that summer, the thing I want to be honest about. Because the inside of my own house was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, a happy place during those 4 months. I was running 2 lives. The life on the outside, Thomas and the 4 of us at dinner on Sunday nights, the quarterly board call in May, the lab in the morning, my daughter on the couch in the evening, was the life everybody else thought I was living. The life on the inside was a slow, careful, 4-hour-a-week disassembly of a man I had loved for 9 years, and the 2 lives never crossed. And the strain of that, of holding both of them in one body, of saying "trust the grain, brother" back to Tomas in the parking lot on a Tuesday morning and meaning 2 completely different things by it, that strain did something to me that I think I am still walking off. I lost about 11 pounds between February and August. Saba thought I had a low-grade thyroid thing. She made me a doctor's appointment. I went. The blood work was clean. The doctor said I was probably just stressed about Series C, which was true, in a way. The 3rd thing that summer was Brian Chen. I had to tell Brian. There was no version of any of this that did not require Brian. Because Brian was lead Series B and he was on our board, and the moment we brought a USPTO inequitable conduct filing forward, Brian was going to be the man holding the gavel on Tomas's removal from the cap table. I needed him on my side, and I needed him on my side 6 weeks before the music started, and I needed him to know enough to not flinch when it did. So I asked Brian for a coffee. I asked him for it on a personal email account. I asked him to meet me at a small diner in Scottsdale on a Sunday morning at 7 a.m. I said only that I needed to walk him through something that touched on Selene's IP. He said yes. He came alone. He drove himself. Brian Chen is 61 years old. He runs about $4 billion in growth equity. He has been on 20-something boards. He has the kind of face that does not move when you tell it news. I told him everything in about 35 minutes, in the corner booth of an empty diner that smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, with no notes, no devices on the table, both of us drinking black coffee out of thick white mugs. He listened. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he sat for about 10 seconds, and he said one sentence. He said, "Aaron, do you have proof?" I said, "I have proof." He said, "Then this is going to work, and I am with you the whole way." He said, "I have seen this exact thing twice in my career. The men who survived it were the men who did not raise their voices. You are doing it right. Keep doing it right." And then he asked me one more question that surprised me. He said, "Aaron, does Greta know?" And I said, "No, Greta does not know anything." And he sat with that for a long moment, and he said, "Greta is going to have to know. And I think you have already thought about that, and I think you are going to do the right thing by her too." And I nodded, and I drank my coffee. And we did not speak for about a minute. I want to tell you about the Saturday in August that I drove Marina to a robotics tournament. Because of all the days in those 8 months, that was the day I almost broke. Greta was on call at Phoenix Children's that weekend. Thomas was in Singapore for what he had told the board was a customer discovery trip, and what I now knew, with absolute certainty, was a quarterly check-in with the Riverhead leadership team. Marina was 12. She was on a middle school robotics team. The tournament was at a community college in North Tempe. Greta texted me Friday night and she asked if I could drive Marina because her own backup had fallen through. I said of course. I picked Marina up at 7:30 Saturday morning. She climbed into the passenger seat of my truck with a robot in a plastic crate on her lap and a backpack that weighed about 35 pounds. She buckled in. She said, "Thank you for driving me, Uncle Aaron." And she said it the way a kid says it when their parents have told them 4 times to remember to say thank you. And I smiled and I said, "Of course, kid." And I pulled out of her driveway. And for the first 8 minutes of that 22-minute drive, she chattered about the gearbox on the robot and about a girl named Priya on her team who she thought was funny and about a math test she was nervous about for Monday. And I drove with both hands on the wheel and I asked her the right questions in the right places and I laughed at the right moments. And about 10 minutes in, Marina looked over at me and she said, "You're a good driver. My dad drives too fast." And I kept my face very, very still. I said, "Your dad drives like a man with a lot on his mind." And she laughed, and she said, "Yeah, he's always got something on his mind." And then she went back to telling me about the gearbox. I dropped her off at the community college at 7:58 a.m. I told her good luck. I waved at her coach. And then I drove 3 blocks down the road. I pulled the truck into the parking lot of a Walgreens that was not yet open, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel and my hands shook for about 10 minutes. I do not know if I have ever told another human being that part. I am telling you. They shook for about 10 minutes and then they stopped. And then I drove to the bungalow office on Mill Avenue. And I worked on the file for 4 hours, because the file was the only thing that was going to make any of it mean anything. And by the second week of September, the file was ready. The second week of September is when the dominoes got set. Nadia closed the file on a Saturday morning in a small office near Mill Avenue with the desk lamp on and the September light coming through the slats of the blinds in long stripes across the floor. The file was 3 inches thick. The cover page said U.S. Patent 11,624,083, Maintenance Review, Confidential, Client, A. Bikel. That cover page was for show. The real file lived behind it. Sarah Boudreau had finished the Wyoming work 2 weeks earlier. She came in that Saturday with a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the desk to me and Nadia at the same time. She said, "Black Mesa Resin Holdings, LLC, Wyoming, formed 22 months and 6 days ago. Sole member of record, Thomas G. Reinhardt. Tax ID Social Security number on the formation packet matches the social on his Solene I-9, which I confirmed through a friend at the bank who I will not name. 22 months of licensing revenue from Riverhead Microsystems Pte. Total $1,407,212.40. Routed through a single Cheyenne business checking account. No co-signatories." Nadia looked at me across the table. She said, "Dr. Bikali, this is the loaded gun in this file. The November 2019 inventorship rewrite is the fraud on the patent office. The Wyoming structure is the motive. The Singapore licensing is the breach of your founder's agreement. Any one of these on its own would be enough. All 3 together are something I have not seen, in 23 years of doing this work, fall apart in court." I sat with that for a minute, and I said, "When?" And Nadia said, "When do you want it?" I had been ready for that question for 3 months. I had a date in my head and I had it for specific reasons. I said, "Monday, October 14th. And Nadia nodded. She said, "Why that Monday?" And I said, "Because Greta's mother is flying back to St. Louis the previous Friday, because Marina has a robotics regional that Saturday that I want her to get to, because the board meets the 3rd Thursday of October, the 17th, and I want Thomas to walk into that boardroom having had 3 days of bad news already." And Nadia closed her own legal pad. She said, "Okay, then we have 4 weeks. We built the 4 packets in those 4 weeks. Packet 1 was the USPTO inequitable conduct filing. 14 pages, plus exhibits. The original 2018 application, the November 2019 amendment, the 2020 declaration filed under penalty of perjury, the Riverhead CAD file with the title block, the Wyoming registered agent records, and a clean 2-page cover declaration signed by me as co-inventor stating, in the carefulest sentences I have ever written in my life, what I had found and when. Mailed certified from a USPS counter in Central Phoenix on Friday, October 11th, addressed to the Office of Enrollment and Discipline at the USPTO in Alexandria, Virginia. The return address was a P.O. box Nadia kept for matters like this one. Packet 2 was the cease and desist letter to Riverhead Microsystems Pte. Nadia's firm had an Asia-Pacific partner in Singapore, a man whose name I will not say here because he was kind to me, and he was the one who FedExed the C&D to the reception desk at Riverhead's office in the Marina One building. The letter was simple. It identified the licensed claim. It identified the licensor as Black Mesa Resin Holdings, LLC, and noted that under the licensing rights paragraph of our founders' agreement, that licensor had no authority to license joint inventorship claims of Solene Microsystems without the co-inventor's signature. It demanded immediate suspension of all use of the licensed technology pending arbitration. It noted that a USPTO inequitable conduct inquiry had been opened against the underlying patent on Monday, October 14th. The letter was timed to arrive at Riverhead's reception at 9:02 a.m. Singapore time on Tuesday, October 15th, which is about 20 hours after the USPTO file landed in Virginia. Packet 3 was the board memo, 26 pages. Drafted by Nadia, reviewed by Brian Chen on the phone in the small bungalow office on the Sunday morning of October 6th. Brian had driven down from his place in North Scottsdale just for that call, and approved without a single substantive change. The memo was titled, with characteristic restraint, Inventorship Irregularities and Off-Books Licensing, co-founder Tomas Reinhardt. It was scheduled to be hand-delivered to each of the 4 other board members by Brian's executive assistant at 6:30 a.m. on Thursday, October 17th, 90 minutes before the regularly scheduled monthly board meeting. Packet 4 was the quietest one. Sarah had spent August looking at Tomas and Greta's joint financial filings, through public records, nothing she did not have a right to, and she had noticed something Tomas had probably never noticed himself. He had been wiring $1,500 a month from the Wyoming account to a private school in Phoenix where Marina was enrolled. He had been paying a portion of Marina's tuition from the LLC, not from his Solene W-2 income, which meant Greta's CPA, when she ran their joint return in the upcoming quarter, was going to find a $1,500 a month line item Greta could not explain. Sarah wrote a single anonymous letter to Greta's CPA. It was 1 page. It said only that the tuition payments on the Reinhardt return for the past 22 months had been originating from a Wyoming domiciled LLC whose tax records the CPA might want to look at more carefully than was usual. The letter was mailed from a UPS store in North Tempe on Wednesday, October 16th. Addressed to arrive at the CPA's desk on Friday morning, October 18th. That was the architecture. USPTO Monday, Singapore Tuesday morning, board Thursday morning, Greta Friday afternoon. 4 days, 4 packets, 4 directions. I drove home from the bungalow office on the Saturday morning of October 12th, and I sat in my own kitchen at noon, and I looked at all 4 packets sitting on my kitchen table, and I asked myself the question I had been carrying for 8 months. The question was, and I want to give it to you the way I asked myself, because the wording matters. The question was, am I sure? And I sat with that question for about 40 minutes, and I thought about my father, in the hospice room, with the late afternoon sun coming through the blinds. And I thought about Greta, in a Tupperware container of casserole whey, the night I introduced Saba to my mother. And I thought about Marina, in the truck on the way to the robotics tournament, calling me Uncle Aaron. And I thought about Tomas, in his office, under the framed napkin, calling me brother. And I thought about myself, at 35 years old, in a Stanford lecture hall, laughing at his line about the loud mouth and the quiet brain. And the answer was, yes. I am sure. Because what he had done could not be unbuilt. And the only choice I had, the only choice he had left me, was whether the next 8 months were going to be him doing it again to somebody else, or me ending it. I sealed the packets. I drove them to 4 different locations across that Sunday afternoon. I ate dinner with Saba and my daughter that night. Saba made a chicken dish her mother used to make. I helped my daughter with her 4th grade fractions homework. I went to bed at 10 p.m. I slept for about an hour and a half. Monday, October 14th, 8:51 a.m. I walked into Celine. Tomas was in his office. The framed napkin was on the wall behind him, where it had been every working day for 7 years. The napkin from Coupa Café, March 14, 2017, with my own handwriting in the corner. He waved me in. He poured me a coffee from the small pot on his credenza. He said, "Aaron, brother, you ready for a really good week?" And I smiled at him. I smiled at him and I said, "Yeah, I think so." The USPTO certified mail receipt scanned at 7:14 a.m. Eastern. The Office of Enrollment and Discipline opened a file at 9:23 a.m. Nadia got the confirmation at 11:46 a.m. Arizona time. She called me at 11:51 a.m. from her cell, not her office. She said one word. She said, "Open." And I said, "Okay." And I hung up. Tuesday, October 15th, 9:02 a.m. Singapore time, which is 6:02 p.m. Monday in Mesa. The FedEx envelope was signed for at the Marina One reception desk. The Riverhead General Counsel, a man named Adrian Lim, who I knew was Tomas's primary contact, emailed the C&D internally at 9:31 a.m. their time. At 10:14 a.m. their time, which was 7:14 p.m. Mesa time, on Monday, Adrian Lim called Tomas's cell. I know because I was in the lab on the 2nd floor of our building, and through the glass wall of the clean room changing area, I saw Tomas pick up his phone in his office, walk to the window, and stand there with his back to the lab for about 9 minutes. And when he turned around, his face was the color of new drywall. He came out of his office. He told the team he had a customer issue, and he had to leave. He grabbed his jacket. He drove out of the parking lot. I watched him through the window. Wednesday, I worked a normal day. Tomas was not in the office. He texted the team that he was working remotely. Brian Chen texted me a single character at noon. He texted, Thursday, October 17th, 8 a.m., the board meeting. 5 board members in the conference room. Tomas, Brian, 2 other partners. The Independent. I am not a board member. I am a co-founder observer. My presence in the room was unremarkable. Brian had distributed the 26-page memo at 6:30 a.m. Each board member had read it. The meeting opened with Brian saying, "And I want to give it to you exactly." Brian saying, "Before we get to the agenda, we have to address a matter. Tomas, we have new information regarding inventorship and off-books licensing of the company's core patent. The full record is in front of each of us. The motion before the board is the termination of Tomas Reinhardt for cause and the immediate suspension of his cap table rights pending resolution. The motion is opened. Is there discussion?" There was no discussion. Tomas tried to speak. He tried twice. The first time he said, "Brian, listen, this is a misunderstanding." And Brian said quietly, "Tomas, read the file." And Tomas looked down at the file. And there was a silence that I will remember for the rest of my life, about 20 seconds long. Tomas put his hand over his mouth and held it there. Brian called the vote. 4 in favor, 1 abstention from Tomas. The motion carried. Tomas was escorted to his office by Brian's executive assistant to gather a small box of personal items. He was off the premises by 8:34 a.m. The meeting had run 22 minutes. Nobody had raised their voice. I was sitting in my own office across the hall at 8:36 a.m. when Thomas walked past my doorway with the box. He stopped. He looked at me. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. He walked out. Friday, October 18th, 2:48 p.m. Greta Reinhardt's CPA, a woman named Eleanor, opened her morning mail. She found Sarah's letter. She called Greta at 3:12 p.m. Greta was in her office at Phoenix Children's between patient consults. The call lasted 4 minutes. Greta canceled her remaining afternoon. She drove home. She called Tomas. Tomas did not pick up. She called Tomas's mother in Munich. Tomas's mother did not know anything. By 6 p.m. that Friday, Greta had her own private divorce lawyer on the phone. By Monday morning she had filed. Friday night, 11:34 p.m. My phone rang in the dark on my nightstand. I had not told Saba any of it yet. I was going to, but not until the weekend. I got out of bed. I walked downstairs in my socks. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table I had sat at on the Saturday morning in February at 4 a.m., with the legal pad and the mug of black coffee, and I answered the phone. He was crying. He could barely talk. He said, Aaron, brother, the board, Greta is, Aaron, I don't know what's happening. And I sat at that kitchen table at 1:45 on a Friday in October, and I held the phone to my ear, and I let him cry for about 30 seconds. And then I said, gently, gentle as anything, gentle as I have ever said any sentence in my entire life, I said, Thomas, get some sleep, brother. We'll talk Monday. And I hung up the phone. And I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with my hands flat on the wood, and I did not move for about 10 minutes. And then I went out to the garage. And I sat in my truck with the door closed and the dome light off and the engine off, in the dark, for a long time before I turned the engine on and pulled it forward into its parking spot and turned it off and got out and went back into the house. I want to tell you about Saturday morning, because that is the morning that actually matters. The rest of it, Monday through Friday, the USPTO file, the FedEx envelope at Marina 1, the 22-minute board meeting, Greta's call to her CPA, that was the machine running. I had built the machine and the machine ran. There is a way in which none of that week was the hard part. The hard part was the Saturday morning after. I got up at 5:18 in the morning. Saba was asleep next to me. I had not told her any of it yet. I want you to sit with that for a second. My wife, who had spent 8 months wondering whether I had a low-grade thyroid issue or a Series C stress problem, was, on that Saturday morning, the only person in our house who did not know what her own husband had spent the previous 8 months building. I had been carrying it alone for the whole 8 months, and I had decided, around the Thursday of that week, that I was going to tell her on Sunday, not Saturday, Sunday. Because Saturday I needed for myself. I made coffee. I did not eat. I drove to Solane. The light coming across the Salt River that morning was the gold low light you get in late October in the desert, the kind that makes the saguaros look almost lit from inside. I pulled into our parking lot at 6:02 a.m., empty. I let myself in with my key. I walked to the gowning area outside the clean room. I put on the bunny suit the way I had put it on every working morning for 7 years. Booties first, then the suit, then the hairnet, then the hood, then the gloves, then the air shower for 15 seconds. I walked into the clean room. The white noise of the HVAC closed over me the way it always does, a low, constant hush, the sound my wife once said she could miss when she wasn't in it. I walked to the deposition tool. Inside the chamber, behind the small viewing window, was a partially completed wafer, Solin 3, the next generation. The one Tomas had been trying to license out the back door of the company for 22 months. I did not touch anything. I just stood at the window of that tool for about 20 minutes, and I looked at the wafer, and I want to tell you what I did not feel that morning. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel relief. I did not feel any of the things you would think a man would feel after he had spent 8 months running a careful operation and watching it land on the man who had earned it. What I felt was a quieter thing than that. What I felt, and this is the thing I am still trying to put into words, what I felt was a kind of strange grief, not for him, for me, for the man I had to become in order to do what I had just done. Because I want to tell you something I figured out that Saturday morning. Standing in front of that deposition tool, in a white suit, in a room with no clocks, I figured out that I had not become the man at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. in February. I had been the man at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. in February. He had been inside me the whole time. He had been waiting. All the way back to a hospice room in San Diego with the late afternoon sun coming through the blinds, where my father, a process engineer who had spent 34 years inside a fab and who had not raised his voice in any conversation I had ever been in with him, said his last sentence to me. "Trust the grain, brother. Don't force it." And on that Saturday morning in the empty clean room, I thought about that sentence again. And I realized that the man my father had seen in me when I was a kid, the boy who would let a deposition recipe stabilize for 40 minutes rather than nudge it, that was the same man who had sat at a kitchen table for 8 months and not raised his voice. The craft is the craft. It does not care what you point it at. And that, I think, is why I felt the grief that morning. Because if patience is a craft, then I am very, very good at it. And being very, very good at it means I am capable of things most people are not capable of. And that is not a comforting thing to know about yourself. I drove home at 9 a.m. Saba was making waffles with my daughter at the kitchen counter. My daughter was wearing pajamas with cartoon foxes on them. Saba looked up at me when I came in. She said, "You okay?" And I said, "Just had to check on a tool." And she nodded. And she went back to the waffles. And I sat at the counter, and I ate a waffle, and I asked my daughter about the math test from Monday, and she told me she got a 94. I told Saba on Sunday, I am not going to tell you what I said to her, because that conversation is mine. I will tell you that I was calm. I will tell you I gave her a single piece of paper with the names of the 4 packets typed on it, and I told her she could ask me any question she wanted. I will tell you that she cried quietly for about 3 minutes, and then she said one sentence to me, and I will not tell you what that sentence was. And I will tell you that she put her hand on my hand on the kitchen table, and we sat together for about an hour without saying anything else. I told the team on Tuesday at 9 a.m. I called an all hands in the lab, 11 people. Brian Chen flew down from Scottsdale and stood next to me. I said only that the board had separated from Thomas Reinhardt for cause, that the company's IP position was secure, that nobody else's job was at risk, that we were going to ship Solane 3 in December the way we had always planned, and that I would answer any honest question anybody had as long as they understood I could not say anything about the specific cause. 2 of the engineers cried. None of them quit. We were back at our benches by 9:42 a.m. 3 weeks later, the cap table mechanics closed. I am not going to walk through the legal mechanics because they are boring and they are not the point. The point is this. Thomas's stake in Solane Microsystems was sold, through a court-appointed trustee, to a holding company called Reeves Holdings LLC, which had been formed in July of that year, and whose sole member of record was me. I had named it for my mother. Her first name was Reeve. She had passed in 2016. She would have understood it. I paid 31 cents on the dollar for his half. Solane 3 shipped in December. The inventor line on the new continuation patent, the one Nadia had cleaned up in the wake of the inequitable conduct ruling, has my name on it. It does not have Thomas's name on it. I am the sole listed inventor of every claim on which the deposition methodology depends. That is correct. That is the correct line. Riverhead Microsystems Pre-T settled out of arbitration in February of the following year for an amount I am not allowed to disclose. The number was significant. The license was terminated. The Singapore operation, as far as I know, has pivoted to a different process. I do not follow them. I do not need to. Thomas pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of tax evasion the following spring. He served 14 months in a low-security facility in West Texas. He is out now. I have not seen him. I have not spoken to him since the phone call at 1:45. Greta and I trade short texts on the children's birthdays. Their divorce was final about 10 months after the Friday afternoon her CPA called her. Greta moved with Marina to St. Louis to be closer to her family. Marina is 14 now. She is on her high school robotics team. I am glad about that. Marina's birthday was last March. I did not send a card. I had thought about it for a week. I had sat at my desk in the small office off our kitchen with a card in front of me. A generic one, no message, just a number 13 on the front, and I had not been able to write anything inside it. So I had put the card back in the drawer. Marina did not call me to ask why. She has not asked about me in a year. I do not bring it up to Greta. Children let go faster than we do. That is one of the only mercies in any of this. Nadia Okafor came in for a quarterly check-in in late November. We sat in my office. She wore the same black blazer over a different gray t-shirt. She had her steel mug. She had a single legal pad. She walked me through 3 small follow-ups, and she closed her pad and she looked at me across the desk and she said, very quietly, Dr. Bikulle, I am glad we did it the way we did. I have been thinking about it. And she said, I do not ask questions I do not want answered. And you are the kind of client who let me not have to. I am grateful for that. And I sat with her for a minute, and I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. The framed photograph of Marina holding my daughter at 2 months old still hangs in my living room. I have not taken it down. I do not know that I ever will. Saba has not asked me to. I think she knows. So that's the whole story. I'm not going to tell you I felt good about any of it. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like a man who had finally learned what his father meant. And I'm still figuring out whether that's the best thing I ever inherited, or the only thing that was ever really mine. And I will tell you this. The first impulse I had at the desk in the dark office at 7:42 p.m. in February was to walk down the hall to Tomas's office and ask him to his face. The second impulse, 20 minutes later in the parking lot, was to drive to his house and ring his doorbell at 9 at night and make him say it. If I had done either one of those things, none of the rest of it would have happened. The USPTO file would not have landed. The C&D would not have terminated the license. The board would not have voted on Thursday. Greta would not have known what to ask her CPA. Solene 3 would have shipped under a cloud, and the man who had used my father's last words to sell the people who trusted him would have walked away with the difference. And I would have been a man who got something taken from him. And that's why I didn't say anything for 8 months, because the alternative was a man I didn't want to be. Thanks for watching Ruthless Retribution.